live stream going.
And so just so everybody knows, we're going to start with Jersey Kean. They have a hard timeline today that they have to follow. And so then after them, we'll start going more into the roundtable discussion. Senator Kean and I will take turns introducing you, but also letting you tell us who you are and a little bit about yourself. And we hope you ask questions as well. We want it to be a back and forth discussion between all of us. And we understand if you had to get off, because I know Devin's got school today.
All right, so we are live now, so feel free to start.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Senator Kristin Corrado, and I represent the 40th Legislative District in New Jersey. I'm very happy to be here with all of you today. The pandemic has uprooted every facet of our lives, including the education of our children. Back in March 2020, life as we knew it came to a screeching halt. Instruction immediately shifted from the school to the screen. Almost 15 months later, many New Jersey students, through no choice of their own, continue to learn either at home or part-time in school. We've learned so much during this time period and since the beginning of the pandemic. And based on most of the up-to-date data, in-person learning in schools has not been associated with substantial community transmission. My office has met with and heard from hundreds of parents who simply want the option to have their children back in school full-time as soon as possible. They are also extremely concerned about the impact of being out of the classroom and how are we going to address the learning loss when we go back into school next year. I decided to host this roundtable with Senator Kean so that we can bring attention and awareness to these really important and pressing issues. So today we're going to hear from parents, students, education professionals about returning to the classroom full-time and the challenges and concerns resulting from the pandemic-related disruptions. We encourage all of our participants to add comments and ask questions and contribute to this lively discussion. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Senate Minority Leader Tom Kean.
Thank you, Senator Corrado. Thank you for organizing this panel presentation. My name is Tom Kean. I serve as the state senator from District 21. The COVID-19 pandemic created the single largest disruption of education in history. At one point, it affected nearly 1.6 billion learners in more than 200 countries. School closures impacted more than 94% of the world's population. Needless to say, the dramatic changes of this kind of disruption played out differently in every state, every school district, and every home, with one common similarity: that the pandemic challenged everything we knew about traditional education practices. Those of you participating today can speak personally to that perspective. The goal of today's roundtable is to not just provide a voice to the students, the parents, the educators, and the experts who are truly on the front line every day, but also to channel your information and your insights into how we can move forward from here. Some have said we can leverage this moment to build back better and use what we have learned over the course of the past year to reimagine and reform the education system. And perhaps that is true. But first, as many of you know, we truly need to figure out how we navigate the losses and the setbacks, academic, social, emotional, so that so many have experienced over the past 2 school years. We have to prepare before we can rebuild. I want to thank all of you for agreeing to participate and look forward to a productive policy discussion. It's my pleasure to introduce Patricia Morgan from NJ Kean. Can you please tell us a little bit more about yourself and your organization?
Morning, senators, and thank you for having us today to present on this really critical time for our students and families across the state. Jersey Kean is a statewide education research, policy, and advocacy organization. And I'd love to share with you this morning some really important research we've conducted over the last several months about the impact of COVID in our schools and some recommendations regarding what we can do moving forward to ensure that all students are mitigating learning gaps and getting back on track.
We have a screen sharing enabled if you want to start your presentation.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So Jersey Can felt it was extremely important to get a snapshot of what was happening with real New Jersey students using real New Jersey data in New Jersey, and really crystallize what the academic loss for some of our students is in New Jersey. And building on that, we wanted to be solutions oriented. So we have a two-part report. The first part of the report that I'm going to discuss with you today really looks at that actual learning loss. The second part looks at bright spots across our state. We know that previously there have been students who've been behind in our state, and that we have tools and resources to get students back up to speed. And so we wanted to find bright spots throughout the state using national, but also state research to be able to shine a light on those best practices for schools to be able to implement moving forward. So part one of this report really focused again on the academic learning loss. As I said, there had been many national studies, but this is really the first of its kind, looking at actual New Jersey students using actual New Jersey data. We know, based on what Senator Corrado said, and Senator Kean, what you said about the drastic impact across the state, but also across the world, that this shutdown due to COVID-19 has the ability to drastically exacerbate educational inequities. And so what we did with this first study is we looked at student data from New Jersey, grades 3 through 8, to answer 3 questions. First, we looked at how student academic growth changed since schools shifted to distance learning due to the pandemic. Second, we looked at what that impact would have on student proficiency. Quite simply, whether students would be on grade level or not. And then third, we tried to get an understanding of whether the results would differ based on student demographic groups. Here's what we found. For the first 5 months of this school year, we found that students did not make the anticipated growth that we would have expected for the first half of the school year. So what we did is we used actual student data from 18,000 students from across the state to look at their scores from the start of the school year to the midway point in the school year to see if they made 5 months of academic growth during that time, the amount of growth that we would expect to see for students during that time period. And what we found was that on average, students in grades 3 through 8 lost 30% of expected learning in English language arts and 36% of expected learning in math. And we did find that there were differences based upon a student's demographics. So our economically disadvantaged students lost more ground in math than their affluent peers. So they lost about 40% of expected learning in English language arts, but they lost as much as 43% of learning in math. What was extremely troubling is that our Black and Latinx students lost more learning in both English language arts and math than their peers. And this was the case regardless of their economic status. So we found that Black students on average lost 43% of expected learning in English language arts. And Latinx students lost 37% of expected learning. In math, our Black students lost the most. They lost on average 50% of expected learning in the first half of this school year. And Latinx students lost 40% of expected learning in math. What's critically important here is that there are some longstanding achievement gaps in New Jersey that I know both of you are aware of. And so these groups of students already tend to be behind due to achievement gaps. So these the COVID-19 pandemic, we're concerned, is going to further exacerbate and push these students even further behind during this time. Our students with disabilities also lost more learning than their peers, losing about 44% of expected learning in English language arts and losing about 50% of expected learning in math. Again, this is the first half of this school year. Now, what's interesting is our English language learners did have a bright spot when it came to math. There still was significant learning loss, but they did do better in terms of their academic gains in math during the first half of this school year than their peers. This could be due to math being able to translate more easily between different languages than English language arts. So this is an area we absolutely should be focused on moving forward and see if there is a bright spot in a learning lesson here as we continue to collect data and look at our education recovery for our students. So what does all this mean? The second question we looked at is, what does this learning loss during the first half of the school year, what does the stoppage of schools or the slowdown, the interruption in learning, what did it actually mean for students? Well, based on the test scores that we looked at, we found that a majority of students started the school year behind. So if you look at this graph, you can see that prior to the pandemic, we had about 58% of students on grade level in English language arts and about 45% on grade level in math. Due to the spring shutdown and the summer slide, that shifted to where projections are that only about 40% of students were on grade level in English language arts and only 29% at the start of this school year. And due to the less than expected growth that we just discussed, those numbers further dropped. So now if we were to give tests this spring, our statewide assessments, we're projecting that only 34% of students would be on grade level in English and only 22% in math. What does this really mean? Only 1 in 3 of our students is on grade level now in English and only 1 in 4 in math. So some pretty significant declines for our students. Crystallizing this even a little bit further so we understand how many students this actually is. In English language arts, we had about 143,000 students fall off grade level. And in math, that's about 129,000 students fall off grade level just from the COVID-19 shutdown. And our third question, which we've discussed a little bit already, is whether or not these shutdowns and the interruption to our students' learning has had an impact disproportionately on different groups of students. And the answer is yes. We found that the achievement gap is growing for our low-income Black and Latinx students. And if you look in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll be able to see what I mentioned earlier, which is that regardless of socioeconomic status, our Black and Latinx students have the biggest challenges lying ahead of them in terms of academic achievement. So we felt that it was critically important to start this work by measuring the learning loss so that parents, teachers, decision makers like yourselves, that our state government can all come together to understand the extent of the problem. Because quite simply, if we don't understand the extent of the problem, we can't work together as a broad community to solve the problem. So we felt that we absolutely needed that baseline information. But now that we have it, we think it's critically important that we all have discussions about how best to move our students and communities forward. And so we also engaged in a research and policy analysis to find the best practices both nationally and here in New Jersey to help students close learning gaps, to help support them socially and emotionally, and to figure out what tools our teachers need to be able to serve students moving forward. And so we curated all of the national research, local research on these issues into 5 key areas. Effective resource allocation for equitable systems, really looking at, are we putting our dollars to work and in the right places? Data for understanding student learning. Do we have the data systems and are we collecting the data we need to know if we're moving our students forward? Educator support and innovative staffing. Are we giving our teachers the tools they need? And are we thinking critically about ensuring that we have the staff members we're going to need in classrooms, but in our broader school buildings to be able to support our students moving forward? And then high quality, inclusive curriculum, instruction, and training. Do we know that we are using the best resources in our schools to actually ensure academic achievement and also career readiness for our students? And then finally, perhaps the most important area is student and family engagement. This pandemic has brought the schoolhouse into every individual's house here in New Jersey. And parents have had a real bird's eye look at their students' classrooms and what they're learning. And parents want more detailed information about what their students are learning, how they're doing moving forward. So this relationship between students and families, we should be building on moving forward. 3 specific things I'd like to mention this morning of actionable things we could be thinking about as a state and as a community. Around student and family engagement, there has been some excellent national research on the idea of a school navigator for students. This is an individual in the school building who's working with and checking in on and developing a relationship with each student individually to be able to check up on their social emotional health and how they're reacclimating to the school building. What's unique about this is that this is someone other than the classroom teacher, which allows the classroom teacher to focus solely on the student's academic growth. Secondly, we think focusing on this high quality and inclusive curriculum is really, really important. If we're not using high quality materials to teach our students, then they're not going to be successful into the future. And so we really think that all school districts and the department should be looking at how to ensure that our schools are using the best curriculums moving forward. And finally, we really need to focus on educator support and innovative staffing. Before the pandemic, Jersey Kean did a deep dive into the educator workforce in New Jersey, a really comprehensive data-driven analysis. And what we found is that before the pandemic, our educator pipeline had decreased by 25%. So even before the pandemic, schools were having real difficulty finding educators. And what we've been hearing through stakeholder calls with partners, superintendents, participating in legislative hearings, as well as DOE stakeholder meetings, is that quite simply, schools don't have the educators they need or the other staff members to be able to reopen and service our students the way we know we will need to in an intense way in the future. A classroom teacher is the #1 indicator of academic success. So having high quality educators in every classroom is going to be important. If we don't have those brand new educators to pull from our educator pipeline, then we need to be innovative. We need to be thinking about, can we have master classes where a master teacher is zooming into those classrooms where we don't have a highly qualified teacher to be able to teach the content? Are there abilities for us to partner with our higher education institutions to get those with substantive expertise into our actual K-12 classrooms to be able to fill that important need we know we'll have in the next few years? So I want to thank the senators for really focusing on this critically important issue for our students and our families. And I'm happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Stephanie. That was a really impactful and insightful presentation. What would you think the lasting impact of the learning loss that you identified in the report if no meaningful action is taken to address it?
Sure. So national studies conducted by McKinsey estimate at least 1 year's worth of lost earnings for our students based on these learning losses. So we're looking at not only perhaps not having students progress as much academically in terms of college acceptance, college completion, but we're also looking at very real long-term economic impacts for our students if we don't work collectively to close these learning gaps.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a hard conversation to have, to hear that our kids are struggling and falling behind, but I think it's a conversation that we have to have. Because if we don't address it, we're not going to be able to move forward, and it's going to impact everyone. So I think the sooner we do this, the better. It's something, that conversation we have to have now going into next year's school year. And you've certainly provided a lot of information that's really helpful.
Thank you. I think unfortunately, it's kind of similar to going to the doctor and getting your checkup, right? Sometimes you get information you may not want to hear, but these statistics are so staggering that they need to be at least given consideration, because if you don't know the extent of the problem, you don't know what options are on the table to solve it. And if you think you have a little problem, you're going to think, you're going to look for a little solution. But when you look at the real learning loss that's occurring across our state, and you see significantly how this is going to impact our students and families moving forward, we need the understanding of that to really think about what are the best solutions for New Jersey students, parents, and families.
I agree. Does anybody have any questions that they want to ask Patricia before we move on? Okay, well, thank you very much for your time and for all your information that you provided today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So next I'm going to introduce a principal who has the unique perspective on what's gone on during the past year. Joe Acino is the principal at Northern Highlands Regional High School. I believe they've been in school for a while, but he can certainly tell us about the challenges that he's experienced the last 15 months. Just got to unmute.
You would think after all this time, I would know to unmute myself. Anyway, thank you, Senator Corrado, and certainly Senator Kean for having me with you today. I certainly can speak to what impact the pandemic has had on our high school. And I am fortunate that I do speak to other principals throughout Bergen County who are really experiencing the same things. But for all of us, the COVID-19 just didn't take lives. It really challenged our emotional and mental health, really to the point where not many of us really knew what to do at certain times. And while many survived and others suffered, we absolutely saw an increase in stress, anxiety, and depression. And for educators, we were already dealing with that prior to the pandemic. So now here we are, and it really did turn our schools upside down. For Northern Highlands, as Senator Corrado said, we have been open now for, probably a couple of months now. But back when that second wave hit in the wintertime, we had to shut down for approximately 6 weeks. So somewhere from right around Thanksgiving until after the holidays, where we absolutely were we were dealt about 51 positive cases of our students, and we couldn't get back to school. So for us, we had to now deal with more isolation and more disrupted routines which really was a struggle in our school. And the impact of all of the lockdowns and unemployment and disruptions and loss of loved ones really, really impacted our students. So I guess in a sense, we're starting to see, and Northern Highlands is a very high performing school district. So, pardon me, we're a very high performing school district. And one of the things that we can say is, like, early on with virtual learning, it was a novelty for the most part, our students were, hey, this is new, we're going to deal with this. But as it went on, our students were no longer engaged. They were just checking out. So we absolutely saw an increased result in our failures. So just to give you a little data, at the end of semester one, which usually ends in mid-January, so this is going back to the 1920 school year, we had 5 students that accounted for failure of 8 courses. 5 students accounted for the failure of 8 courses. Now, this year, when we did an analysis of our grades, we had 45 students who accounted for the failure of 67 courses. That is unlike anything that we've ever seen here at Northern Highlands. So one of the things that we have to do now, many of our students have always taken enrichment courses in the summertime, but because of the number of increased failures, we now are starting a summer academy at Northern Highlands for the first time to provide students with enrichment opportunities, because they were doing that anyway, but more so to deal with all of the learning loss that has taken place over the last, I'll say, 14 months now. So, that academically, that's an issue for us, and we'll continue to deal with that. We're thankful that we do have funding in order to offer the academy. But the other big piece that we've seen over the year is that social aspect that school has. I can't tell you how difficult it has been. We all pride ourselves on building relationships with our students, and it becomes very difficult trying to do that with students who you can't even see when they're in class and they have half a head showing. Okay, doesn't look like we're seeing it right now. These kids don't want to be seen. There's Zoom fatigue. There's so many things that that we have to deal with, and building relationships is a key here at school. And those social aspects that are being lost has really taken a toll on our kids. So, I mean, here we're talking about athletics were canceled or delayed. Okay, all of these things that they do, extracurricular activities that they participate in, those are the cornerstone of what high schools have to offer, and they provide long-lasting memories that our students right now are really starting to struggle with. So, I mean, for the most part, our staff has shown resiliency, but we still have to deal with a lot of students who have been impacted from that social aspect. And I'll give you a little bit more data if I can. I will say that our students who are at risk remained at risk, but it's those students who are on the cusp that we absolutely see now have taken or traveling another road right now. And information that I received from our wellness department. So just this year alone, they have provided over 725 appointments for students. They met individually with 230 students. So that's 16% of our student population. 79% of the students returned for at least one additional appointment. And the increased number of students that they've seen daily has doubled. So it was 27, now this is daily, 27 back in the 1920 school year to 54 this school year. So we absolutely have seen a huge impact that it has had on our students who have struggled, and we're doing the best that we can. So I'd be more than happy to answer any questions for you, senators, but that's the impact that it has on Northern Highlands and other Bergen County schools as well, from the principals that I speak with.
Yeah, thank you, Joe. I don't think it's, unique to your school. And I think it's so important that we have the education and the learning loss component, but we cannot discount the importance of the social and the mental health. And I noticed that when you were speaking on those issues, Devin was nodding her head. And I'm going to go over to Devin because she's a senior in high school, and she's one of our rock star students. She's a student athlete, and she, always succeeds at what she challenges come her way. But it's been a really difficult year, and it's impacted students in a way that, us, the older generation, can't even begin to understand. And so I'm going to ask Devin to tell us a little bit about the experiences that she's had this past year.
So the last time I had a normal school day was on March 13th, 2020. And since then, I've been physically in school for 2.5 days in this entire year, the last one being on September 15th. So to say that online school has affected me immensely would really be an understatement. Last March, when my school announced there would be virtual classes all the way up to the beginning of this year, there were little to no structured classes. We were just sent our assignments at the beginning of the week and expected to complete them by the end of the week. There was no instruction, no real learning. I sat in my room alone, working for hours a day, teaching myself lessons, doing busy work. And like I said before, that went on for months. I wish I could say it felt any different when we did start to have Zoom classes every day. I hold a 4.3 GPA and am ranked 20th in my graduating class, but online learning has still been extremely difficult for me. It's difficult to stay engaged, difficult to stay motivated, and most significantly, difficult to truly learn. The dynamic of being in school and in the same room as your teachers and classmates is completely irreplaceable, and I don't doubt for a second that my education has suffered from online learning. This is not at the fault of my teachers, nor me, nor my school, but merely online learning in itself. An entire aspect of learning comes from discussion and being able to bounce ideas off one another. This is completely lost when you have to click a button to raise your hand and then click another to unmute to speak. It's so unnatural and uncomfortable that it's extremely difficult to engage and actually want to participate. The reason I've been in school so little in the past year is for a multitude of reasons. Of course, last year schools had no choice but to close down due to the state of emergency of the pandemic. However, my school has been on and off this year with a hybrid schedule and now is back almost full time, allowing students to come into school for half days a week. The main reason I have not been in school since September is in my senior year is because of sports. With contact tracing and strict rules schools are being forced to follow, it is too much of a risk for me to go into school and potentially be exposed to someone who has COVID and then have to quarantine myself and miss out from my sports, which is truly the only thing that has allowed me to experience some normalcy throughout the pandemic. In the fall, during my soccer season, I was exposed to a positive case on September 15th and was the only person on my team who had to stay home. And at that point, we were only going to school for 1.5 day a week, and none of my best friends were in my cohort. Meaning, by going to school, I was risking seeing my best friends every day at soccer for going to school 4 hours a week with people who I don't speak to outside of school. And this is why I chose to stay home and continue to choose to stay home, even though I'm in my last 2 months as a high school senior and would love to be back in school. Although this is a decision I had to make, I truly do not believe that myself and other student athletes were given much of a choice at all. We were forced and are continuing to be forced to choose between our education and our emotional well-being. And for myself, since it feels as though our education has been put on the back burner for the time being, with school closures and harsh restrictions, activities where we can escape from the reality of the past year take priority. Therefore, until there is a way for schools to be guaranteed more freedom and can promise their students they can return to school with little to no risk of exposure or quarantine, our education is not going to improve and the emotional well-being of students in New Jersey will continue to suffer. Thank you.
Thank you, Devin. I know it's been an incredibly tough experience for you and other students throughout the state and the country. Devin, you're going to college, right? Can you tell us a little bit about that experience, applying to schools remotely?
Yes, so I actually got a little bit lucky because I was able to commit to Rowan University last February for softball, but I'm completely missed out on the experience of getting tours and having usually when you commit for sports, you can have a sleepover like in the fall to see what the practice schedule is like and to stay with the players, but I completely missed that opportunity because of COVID, and I haven't been there since August, so I haven't seen the school since I've applied there, so it's been extremely.
Yeah, thank you for sharing your story. Does anybody have any questions of Devin?
I've got a quick thing for if any of the panelists or Devin or Joe can answer the question regarding what can we do from the state legislature or from the Department of Education to make sure that you feel comfortable going into school in the fall, that you're safe and that the education can be provided in addition to the PPE, the vaccinations, and some of those other efforts. What are the things that can actually make you feel safer participating in the school in the fall?
Senator, I could, if you don't mind, I can offer a little insight to that. One of the things, and Devin kind of reminded me with regard to quarantining, especially students in classrooms, who, by the way, were not in close contact. You know, the health departments identified close contact as being less than 6 feet, and even without a mask on. And in some cases, health departments were shutting down schools or telling kids to quarantine, even though they weren't in close contact. And that took our athletes took a huge hit on that. And to tell an athlete, especially one, you know, and Devin sounds like she's a tremendous athlete, you know, to tell a student, you have to quarantine for a period of time when you weren't within 6 feet of someone who was COVID positive, that's very difficult. So in my dealings with the health department, this is what I have found. Health departments throughout the state of New Jersey have all been very inconsistent with what they were sharing with their schools. So here at Northern Highlands, we have to deal directly with the Bergen County Health Department. Another school like Ridgewood High School, they just deal with their village health department. So when Northern Highlands has to shut down for a 2-week period, based on the same experiences that Ridgewood High School went, and they were allowed to stay open, that becomes a huge struggle for us to try to explain to our parents why one school can stay open and participate in all of their extracurricular activities, yet Northern Highlands had to shut down. So if anything, I think statewide, I think all of the health departments just have to be consistent so that we don't have to answer and address all those irate parents, which obviously I understand where they're coming from. So that's one thing I can certainly share with you.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Great point.
It's my privilege to introduce our next panelist, who is a Brown economics PhD, Alex Lefkoff. He's got some incredible statistics regarding the rising depression, mental illness in kids since they've not been in school, which is a very appropriate point of this conversation to have him participate. Thank you for joining us today, Alex.
Senators, I would like to thank you for hosting this really important conversation. And I'd like to thank the panelists. The first presentation on Jersey Can, I think it's really important project. I think what I'm going to share today is very much in line with what we heard at the beginning of the discussion. Just as a background, I come into this discussion first and foremost as a parent. We live here in Summit, New Jersey. We have 3 children in elementary school, middle school, high school. We're fortunate. We have a terrific sport community. We engage in every possible sport that our wonderful community has to offer. So I come both from the perspective of a parent who is living and breathing what we all going through. But for this discussion, some other discussions that we have in the community, the small contribution I would like to make is really to shed light on some of the ongoing research, some of it in New Jersey, some of it, broader, just to give some perspective around some of the consequences of school closures, restrictions on sports, the mental health consequences we heard from Devin firsthand, on her experiences. So I'll be brief, but I'd like to kind of bring to your attention some of the ongoing research, and and very happy to follow up if there are any questions. So shortly after the COVID outbreak, the Lancet journal, this is probably one of the most famous peer-reviewed journals in the medical community, launched a COVID-19 commission that was looking at a variety of studies and research, looking in the implications of ongoing pandemic. They specifically were focusing, one of the segments of the commission was looking at the mental health consequences of school closures, of sport restrictions. And they looked at studies and data in China, UK, France, Japan, Australia, and the US. Host of research, host of data, and methodologies. And one of the conclusions, the report is available online. The Commission published its report in February. And I'm going to quote one of the conclusions from the report. A clear and consistent body of evidence suggests that mental health has declined during COVID-19, and some early but informative data suggests that self-harming behaviors have increased in some places, but not in others. The report, looked at hundreds and thousands of cases of data across various geographies, and I urge anyone who is who has some time to look at the report. Closer to home, I do want to talk a little bit about the implications on sport restrictions. Again, we heard from Devin, but one important study that was conducted by University of Wisconsin Madison recently looked at full participation across student athletes in grades 9 through 12 across 44 schools in the Wisconsin area. And what's interesting about this study is that in some districts, sports were allowed. In other districts, for a host of reasons, sports were not allowed. So you have this two different groups of athletes who are same grades, very similar schools, very close in proximity to each other, but some were not allowed to participate in sports and some were allowed. We're talking about 559 students, and the researchers from the University of Wisconsin Madison were following these athletes throughout the fall. The results are really, they're clear cut and they're somewhat disturbing, I would say. If we look at students and the questions the students were asked, there were a host of questions around anxiety and depression. And there, again, the two separate, just to remind you, two different groups of students. So percentage of students who reported severe anxiety was 9 times higher among students who were not allowed to participate in sports relative to students who were allowed to participate. The percentage of students who reported moderate or severe depression was 3 times higher among athletes who did not participate in sports in fall 2020. So here's a recent study of almost 600 students in grades 9 through 12, almost a natural separation between those who were allowed to participate versus who were not. And I think the numbers, speak for themselves. I do want, this is not something I prepared to talk about, but going back to the Jersey Kean conversation and kind of the implications of we see in grades 1 through 8, I would like to highlight some of the research by Professor James Heckman, who is a Nobel winning economist from the University of Chicago, who spent his career looking at implications of having gaps in early education, especially grades 1 through 4. And I'm sure Ms. Morgan is aware of the research, but the long-term implications and consequences of gaps in education in the early years are quite important and significant. These are all my prepared remarks. Again, I thank you, senators, for giving me a chance to provide some insights into ongoing research, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you.
Do you have any suggestions on how we deal with this increased depression and anxiety as we move forward in the upcoming, school's going to be over soon for most students, and we won't see them again until September, and hopefully everybody's back in full time by then and sports are allowed, but we just don't know.
Yeah, I'm not an expert in mental health. I'm not in the medical profession, but what I would say as someone who evaluates research and the data and as a parent, I think we need to take a balanced and measured approach. COVID is a risk for sure, but there are downsides of keeping students away from school, away from sports, and we should look at the data. And this is something I didn't mention, but there's a separate research going on at the Brown University looking at Professor Emily Oster's collecting data across 47 states, 200,000 students, looking at rates of COVID within schools and surrounding communities. Her research was, discussed at the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and other areas. What's interesting is that in her data, what she's showing is that the rate of COVID in schools simply represents the rate of COVID in the surrounding community. What she says basically, and I'm going to quote, it doesn't seem that schools are super spreaders of COVID. So, this is more of a question to the administrations, potentially, the senators and others, really to think about, what are we seeing in the data? Do we see schools, being super spreaders, or maybe that's not the case? How should we think about the risk of sport participation? Do we see indeed, sport activities spreading COVID among students? So, so I would just take a measured approach and evaluate the pros and cons of restricting our students from being outside and being in schools where, in my view, they belong.
Thank you.
I think as each person speaks, it just reinforces that it's not just the education component, it's the social, it's the sports, it's the mental health, that are all issues that we're going to have to address now before the school year ends and the new year starts. Next, we're going to have some parents that have been advocates for going back to school, having schools reopen. And Patricia is actually one of my constituents, and she really was the reason behind this. We had some conversations with her, and we had some roundtable discussions with parents, and we did it remotely, we did it virtually, but their stories were too important not to be heard. And that's when we kind of got the idea that this issue is bigger than just one school district, and that we needed to really open up the conversation and start it now and keep it going as we move forward. So we have Patricia and Paula who are going to address going back to school for both of us.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, senators, for affording me the opportunity to speak today. I am a mother to 3 boys, ages 10, 13, and 14. I work as a law professor, and this year I have become a vocal advocate of getting our children in school full-time. Locally, I am part of a parent coalition in Cedar Grove, fighting hard to restore full-time in-person instruction and to rid our district of an inadequate hybrid learning model, which up until very recently allowed our children to attend school in person only every other week and only Monday through Thursday, not Fridays, and only for mere half days. Reopening schools fully has been a near impossible task, given Governor Murphy's policies, which in my view have prioritized other interests over the education and emotional and psychological well-being of our school children. To be clear, Governor Murphy made the decision to not require schools to open full-time this year, despite evidence that schools were safe, children were generally resistant to contracting COVID, and unlikely, as Alex said, super spreaders of the virus too. Even now, with COVID cases, positivity, and transmission rates dropping, and over 1/3 of the New Jersey population fully vaccinated, including our dedicated teachers, Governor Murphy still refuses to mandate schools return to full-time in-person instruction immediately. And this refusal to do so now has caused and continues to cause devastating damage to our children, some of which will be irreparable. My coalition has heard from so many parents about how hybrid learning has ruined their children academically, mentally, socially, and physically. We've heard stories of children who are forced to learn at home alone without guidance or support as their parents work. We've heard stories of children who have become physically unfit because of the excessive time spent sedentary on their devices, or where overeating is a real problem because they are bored by the monotony of online learning. We've heard stories of children with IEPs who have regressed academically as well as emotionally because they cannot learn while sitting in front of a screen for any extended time. We've heard stories of children who were happy and outgoing and on honor roll but now need tutors and have become sad and anxious, feeling totally isolated and alone? We've heard stories of children who are so withdrawn and in distress that they are meeting with counselors and need psychotherapy and other intervention services. Virtual learning, hybrid learning, it's not adequate, it's not sustainable, and it's not equitable. It is undisputed that the learning loss this year is tremendous. In Cedar Grove, this learning loss is exacerbated by the fact that our afternoon sessions are short, entirely virtual, oftentimes optional, and involve little to no engagement. Additionally, there has been no teaching on Friday afternoons since the beginning of the school year, none, as our district decided to eliminate that Friday instruction altogether. Thus, our children have been shortchanged hours of learning each week. Add to that the fact that we know virtual learning is inferior to in-person learning. It is passive in nature and it involves distraction, among other things. What's also problematic is that the physical and other constraints have forced teachers to abandon best practices in teaching. As we all know, children learn differently. They have different learning styles. For example, the oral learner learns through speaking, the visual learner through pictures, the kinesthetic learner through movement. Not only has most learning occurred in isolation over a computer screen, but it has been largely one-dimensional, only reaching students who can follow along through listening or reading and writing independently. Children have not been able to meaningfully collaborate, work on group-based projects, move around in the classroom, and use manipulatives as guides. In other words, we have not been teaching to all the different types of learners. As a result, for many, their learning has not just slowed, but has regressed. Nor have our teachers been able to support children in the same way when they teach them online. Take my 8th grader, for example, where math poses a challenge for him. He routinely tells me, you know, Mom, math is so much easier in school. I can't do it at home. I can't do it online. Well, why not? Because he's working on a screen rather than using paper and a pencil. He doesn't have the teacher observing his process firsthand, nor does he have the opportunity to work in small groups and get his classmates' feedback or receive the more spontaneous input and clarification that only comes from in-person interactions. And this example is a simple one. Now imagine a student who struggles in more than one subject, or has no support network, or has a learning disability, or where English is the second language. Next, imagine one of the 28,000 students who live in Patterson. That student hasn't entered a school building since March 2020 and has little to no hope of doing so by year end. That harm is unfathomable. It's not quantifiable. And the harm isn't just academic, as we've been talking about. There's harm to the emotional, psychological, and social well-being of our children too. Those concerns are extraordinary. So much so that in Cedar Grove, we've decided to eliminate the librarian media specialist positions at our elementary school for next year in favor of hiring counselors. Our children, as we've discussed, are feeling frustrated, unmotivated, apathetic, and despondent, with many expressing distressing feelings of isolation and despair. One mother privately shared her worry about leaving her middle school student at home alone, while she worked out of fear that he might harm himself. I'll close by saying that it turns out that COVID thankfully spared our children, but our policies regarding schools have ravaged them nonetheless. We did not protect them. They suffered harm anyway, and they will continue to suffer until they return to school full time. Time is of the essence. They need to be back now, and the work needs to begin now. Thank you so much for listening.
And I'd like to thank you, Patricia. I'd like to now introduce Paul, who's a parent from Summit. He's the he leads Super, which is the Summit Parents for Extracurricular Return to Routine. Paul, welcome to the panel, and please tell us a little bit about your experience and your insights.
Good, thank you, sir. Thanks everyone for joining me. It's interesting to the various bits of input today because Alex, myself, a group of parents here, we became involved and then hyper involved based on our concern that the myopic focus was on the return to classroom only, and there was not great enough recognition of the need to also focus on extracurricular activities so we can have, from our district, focus on the multifaceted experience of education, which is everything that our children need. And what I will say is that over the past months going through this, I have, and particularly listening now, I appreciate all the more the interconnection between all of the points, between academics, extracurriculars, classroom, outside, and it comes together to form the holistic experience that these kids need. And so it's impossible for us to deal with just the classroom or just sports without recognizing how it all fits together. And earlier with Deb and her comments, I think that really pointed out that there are consequences, there are unintended consequences, and things that I would say from the lack of awareness in our community of what these kids and what the parents are going through. You do one thing and it's so counterintuitive, but who would think that opening athletics up somehow forces kids to not go to class because of the risk associated with that? So, three things. It's interconnected. Patricia, to your point, it's absolutely tragic. And the third thing I'll point out is unfortunately horribly political. And that's where I am right now. I hate to say it, but there are too many people out there who are thinking more about the politics and re-election as opposed to what's good for these children. And it just really tears me apart when I see what has happened here in our town and the reaction or lack of reaction we've had from many of our elected leaders when we brought these points forward. My personal story, I have a son who's a senior. He had, as everyone with an athlete here, he had his season canceled March 13th last year. He was unable to do anything athletically over the course of the summer, at least anything that was related to our school. His fall season was cut short. And here in our town, fall season was cut short while people played football games 3 or 4 more weeks across the river. I guess COVID doesn't go from our county into Morris County, but it's interesting. It doesn't jump fences at private schools. It doesn't go across rivers. An amazing risk profile that's thrown out there, speaking to the earlier point about the inconsistencies. We went through a very mixed winter. He has suffered 2 quarantines, basically a month in quarantine. He has friends who have suffered as many as 5 different quarantines. That's a total of 10 weeks. And my calculation very quickly amongst the 10 teams here who over the past months have been quarantined for 14 days at a time based on the close contact rules that the principal pointed out a moment ago. We've suffered 16.5 years that kids have spent in their basements since November of last year. And that's at a minimum, and it could be double that. It's just fascinating when we look around. So Alex, myself, and others, we've been working to raise awareness. I think we've been somewhat successful, but we've also been dismissed for the most part and told that there's nothing that can be done. And it's always one of these. It's the Board of Health's fault. Go to the Department of Health, go to others. There's nothing we can do. And we thank you for being here today and listening to us. And going back to the challenge that's been raised a couple of times, what can we do? From my perspective, this comes down to 2 things. It's the Department of Health guidance that's coming out. How do we change that? That's a couple of you. It's pressuring. We have to have change. We have to have relaxation. if anything, outdoor sports should be relaxed all the more in order to give the kids the experience that they're not getting in the classroom. The second thing is, how do we change the data? And not to go into the controversy around this, but without the rules being changed, it comes back to the data in terms of whether we're in orange, yellow, or green, what is driving the state of emergency. And if we question the fundamental data in terms of data dumps and double counts and everything else, let's find a way to clear that up so we exit this emergency as quickly as we can. So listen, in summary, I think people need to recognize not only the data around the statistics around loss of learning, but it's the loss of leading, the loss of lifetime experiences. All of us on this call, we get another shot. I mean, the things we lost last year, work-wise, other things that we do at our ages, we can go back and do these things again, but a kid only has one junior year in high school. You only have one senior year. And it's, we have to get these kids back to routine. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Corrado?
So we couldn't agree more. You know, the inconsistency is something that we're frustrated by too. And full disclosure, I live in a town that's been open since September. They went to school full time this year. And, you know, 2 towns over, they've been closed. So the inconsistency, and it impacts every facet, because either if you're in a system that's closed, you don't understand why your friends in the next town are open, and it impacted, you know, the extracurricular and the sports, and not to mention the impact on the socialization and the mental health. And that's certainly something that Senator Kean and I can work on, making sure that we have more consistent. And even with schools facing 3 feet separation versus 6 feet, you know, there's different standards, you know, that have been talked about for the schools versus every other entity that you walk into in the state of New Jersey or outside. We've got to do better to get the information to be more consistent. And we're smarter. We're so much smarter than we were 15 months ago, and we all know how to be responsible. And I think we have to be given the opportunity as long with our students to be responsible, because they can do it. They've already showed that. So I thank you both.
Yeah.
So
Thank you both.
and the next part of our conversation, unfortunately, is on part of the community that's kind of been left by the wayside during the pandemic. And we have parents who are going to speak, as well as our state ombudsman, and that's the intellectual and developmental disability community that have just been impacted horribly and negatively by this shutdown. And so we have parents from Cedar Grove, Nicole and Chris Donlin, who happen to be not just great parents, but have unique perspectives, because Nicole's a nurse, one of our healthcare heroes, and Chris is a teacher, also one of our heroes during this pandemic. And they can speak about the experiences that they've had with their son this past year. And then we're going to go to Paul Aronson, who is our amazing and unbelievable advocate for all. He is our intellectual and developmental disability ombudsman for the state of New Jersey. And he really has a unique perspective on what's gone on this past year. So thank you, Nicole and Chris.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. And you know, we do have a different perspective on this, being that we've worked through this entire pandemic. My husband's also the fire chief in town. To speak about Liam, he's a 7-year-old boy. He is happy, playful, imaginative, and bright. He is also angry, confused, lost, and at times destructive. In March 2020, he was in kindergarten as a thriving 6-year-old boy. He was full of life and the possibilities it had to offer. His eyes sparkled. He spoke about his day and his friends, and seemed as though we were past the darkness of his diagnosis. For the first time in a long time, we had hope. The pandemic erased our hope. Liam hung on for a few weeks as the new normal of lockdown and virtual education began. He enjoyed being home and navigating the school day in his pajamas, and he often wore his old Halloween costumes. What was happening before our eyes was a change in Liam. He was rapidly regressing with each passing day. Liam became short-tempered, easily frustrated with small tasks and everyday routine. Sitting in front of the computer was not an option. He refused. hitting, kicking, aggression, and anger completely overtaken a boy that would hug and kiss us endlessly. He doesn't sleep in his bed anymore. He needs the comfort and safety of our room. His eyes no longer keep in contact with mine. His mind is overfilled with racing thoughts and his focus is gone. Fast forward to sleepless nights, broken TVs, bruises, and bite marks all over us and our older son. The remainder of 2020 was spent begging for services that he was not getting anymore, services such as speech, occupational, and behavioral therapy that was helping Liam thrive and learn. They abruptly ended as quickly as COVID began. To start the school year, my husband and I knew what it would bring. Liam is now a different version of himself. His bright eyes are dark, and his happy personality is now volatile. When I try to hug and kiss him, he turns around. When the smallest demand is placed on him, he responds with resentment and hostility. Boundaries are gone. His happy spark is gone. Our full of life son is gone. In October 2020, we tried again. We called and emailed teachers, principals, special services. We also met with the superintendent. We asked for educational and behavioral modifications. Each time we were told no. We were told the only option is what we have offered, which is alternating weeks in the classroom. Leo's is in school 8 times a month at best, and at more times than not, he was all virtual. The virtual school day was spent begging and pleading with him to complete an assignment, sit for a few minutes, and mostly defending ourselves against his violence. We are in litigation with an attorney to fight for full-time placement for Liam. Liam needs intense behavioral modifications to bring him back to the thriving boy we once had. His academic scores are below average. He cannot correctly answer 3+1. The lengths the school district is taking to negate our pleas is not only discouraging, it's disheartening. We should not have to fight for his education. We should not have to beg for services. We should not be in this position emotionally and financially. The lowest part of our life was sitting in the psychiatric ER with a then 6-year-old pleading for help. This is not fair. We are heartbroken. We are tired. We are discouraged, but we won't stop fighting to save him, to help get his happy, playful, imaginative, and bright personality back. Sorry, it's been a very long year for us.
Don't be sorry. You know, we're sorry that you're going through this difficulty, and we know that you are courageous to come forward and talk about your experience, and that there's other families that are having the exact same situation, unfortunately, and don't know where to turn or what to do. Unfortunately, it's terrible. It's a terrible situation. And Paul, you hear the same stories every day, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And first of all, good morning to everybody. And thank you to Senator Corrado and Senator Kean for having this discussion and also for including me. Let me tell you a little bit about my office because not everybody knows about the office, and then I'll sort of jump in. So I do have the longest title in state government. I'm New Jersey's Ombudsman for individuals with intellectual or developmental disabilities and their families. It's a position in an office that was created just a little over 3 years ago by the state legislature, led by Senator Kean. Actually, was a driving force behind the creation of this office. It was signed into law by Governor Christie, and then I was appointed by Governor Murphy in April of 2018. And the purpose of the office, the reason it was created was because while in New Jersey, there are a lot of resources for individuals and families with intellectual developmental disabilities, children as well as adults, this system can be not only confusing and it can be overwhelming. And it's very difficult to navigate. It's very difficult to sort of make sure that everybody gets the support and services they need and deserve. And so I have the opportunity to serve in this role. There's 2 of us in our office, and we work with individuals of all ages, children as well as adults through the lifespan. We work with their families. And I always preface what I say by pointing out that by the very nature of the office and the way, we've sort of grown this office, people usually come to us when there's a problem, when the system's not working, when they're falling through a gap. And so I recognize that we don't hear all the success stories always, and that's fine, and that's how it should be. So we have families come to us with all sorts of issues, and we try to sort of connect them and help them sort of not fall through the gaps. Over the last year, we've been dealing with a range of issues and challenges that families have been facing. And, what you, Nicole, and Chris, and, tell us a story about Liam is the story, unfortunately, we've heard so many times, heartbreaking stories of children not only not learning and sort of maybe falling behind a little bit academically, but regressing. The self-injurious behavior, the aggressive, the destructive behavior, the academic losses, as well as the therapeutic losses. And what we've tried to do in our office is, and because, we have I personally have the unique opportunity to work individually with families on a day-to-day basis. I try to have, particularly over the last year, have tried to share the stories and the input we get from families directly with those making decisions in the governor's policy office, in the Department of Health, Department of Education. We work very closely with, trying to sort of connect and make sure that those that are making decisions, have the benefit, if you will, of the input from families sort of struggling through the pandemic. It's heartbreaking. And the truth is, I got an email this morning, virtual learning does work for some folks. It just does, everybody's different, but without question, overwhelmingly, the stories we've heard have been heartbreaking stories of it not working academically, therapeutically, parents begging, for more from the school systems, in person, again, academics and therapies, extended school year in person, an additional school year is now something being debated and discussed down in Trenton. It's heartbreaking. One of the things I'll say to you, Nicole and Chris, please, I'd love to connect with you at some point, and Senator Corrado can connect us. We work with families all the time, and we'll do what we can to make sure, Liam gets the supports he needs to the extent we can. But it's heartbreaking. Again, this is something that we've seen, and I've worked with both Senator Kean and Senator Corrado on different pieces of this, the day programs for adults, for instance. And it's been a struggle for all of us, but in some ways disproportionately impacting, the folks with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families who on a good day are challenged and overwhelmed. So anyway, again, I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this conversation. And again, any of you, but particularly you, Nicole and Chris, feel free to reach out, and love to work with you in any way. Thank you.
Yeah.
Nicole and Chris, what do we need to do? What are the things you experience every day? Your story is heart-wrenching, and I know many families have shared your perspective who are and have seen the regression. What do you think that, from whether it's a school district, the health, the state departments that are impacted, what do you think needs to be done?
Well, I think Senator Corrado kind of touched on it, and it's the consistency in guidance between the districts. If there's roughly 530 districts in New Jersey, there's 530 different sets of rules. The district next to us, all elementary students that had an IEP were allowed to attend every time the building was open, where we were just told no, there was no differentiating between a student with special ed and a regular ed student in our district. So again, it's a lack of consistency and guidance that is driving this. And, again, and Senator Corrado touched on it, where, one town is students are in full time, and the next district over, they're all virtual. It's a lack of consistency in the guidance that's being put forth.
And also what we've noticed, and the biggest issues that we're up against, is because Liam is able to tolerate the school day as far as we were told. So seemingly the issues that we're having with Liam are more in the home and in public venues, whereas in school he's controlling himself. And the biggest fight we are having right now is because he's not exhibiting what we are saying, what we are showing videotape of, what they did see virtually, that the inconsistency in what we're dealing with is we're begging for help, we're begging for placement, because we know that an autistic child can hold it together for X amount of hours a day. And they when they get home, they're just so overwhelmed with that emotion that it just all comes out. And that our biggest fight is, well, yeah, this is happening. He is a behavioral issue. You're just not seeing it because he's controlling that.
And they're saying, it's your problem, not our problem. It's not the school district's problem. But this wasn't happening, prior to March of 2020.
It's heart-wrenching. We're sitting through these IEP meetings and begging and with concrete evidence, and still it's just unrelenting.
The state should really pick up the extraordinary special needs costs. We need to make sure it's also funded on that's by about $150 million extra into the state budget. We also need to make sure there's a census count that you're looking at the way we fund, the actual costs. And that would mean getting to some of the things that would add certainty to the decision-making process at all levels, in addition to some of the health department efforts, is having those types of resources come into the school system would give the parents and the school districts a lot of consistency, and they would be able to better plan, I think, going forward for decades to come, not just the year-to-year, parent by parent, student by student, learner by learner that they have right now. So I think that's one thing the state should be focusing on and be extraordinarily aggressive on to make sure that we pick up the tabs of the extraordinary special needs costs that are experienced by parents and school boards across the state. On another side, Paul, I will tell people on the panel and people across the state, there is not a week that goes by that a constituent does not reach in and reaches out to Paul and his office. And there's not a day that goes by that Paul's not running around the state, answering the questions, finding the solutions. And I will say he's probably the most impactful person in all of state government, if I may be so bold in that way, in terms of the individual impact he has been able to have on families throughout the state. And we need to do whatever we can to empower his voice, the officer's voice, because I think at the end of the day, Paul, we need your insights and your analysis as to, because the parents who are experiencing this are so focused on their family and improving their family's lives that they sometimes don't have the opportunity to come out and participate in the public discussions in ways on the school level, on the municipal level, on the state budget level, on the commissioner level, on the county levels, in ways because there are so many things that are going on in their home lives. Paul, what would you recommend that we do from a policy point of view going forward?
That's an excellent point you make, Senator. Just in terms of, the fact that so often the voice of individuals with disabilities and their family members isn't heard in policy discussions, at council meetings, at Board of Ed meetings, because we don't have the luxury of going to these meetings. We're busy taking care of our families. So, I always say, that we have so many issues as a community, the disability community, that have to be addressed, and we're very diverse and what have you. I think one of the most impactful things we can do going forward is to make sure that people with disabilities and family members are at the table, part of the conversation, and to the extent possible, actually the decision makers, making sure we're appointing people with disabilities and family members, people with lived experience. One of the things, we all, I think, appreciate is diversity in the workplace and how important it is to have gender, racial, cultural representation, because we learn and we build better policies when we have more perspectives. But too often, to your point, Senator, disability, family members, people with lived experience are not at that table. And so that perspective is not heard. And so to the extent we can, and it's a hard balance because families like Nicole and Chris, are very focused on taking care of their child aside from everything else. But we need to find a way to sort of make sure that their voice is heard, that they're helping shape and drive policy going forward.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
One of the nice things, if you can say nice things, we've seen from COVID is the way that the parents have come together as advocates. And organized and just done a tremendous job of getting the information out there and getting that information to us. and how they're working together, so that maybe one had one experience, they can help someone with a similar experience. And that's something we've seen going on throughout the past year. Parents really stepping up and working together, working with the teachers, because a lot of the teachers are in this no-win situation as well. They're parents, so they're either, their kids may be in school or remote, and they're trying to teach. It's a horrible no-win situation all around. And they've come up with ways, that they can work together and do the best for all of our students. One of the things that we are asking the Commissioner of Education to do is to prepare a report on learning loss, including students with disabilities, developmental disabilities during COVID, during the health emergency. And that bill's actually been introduced, and we're asking that that be done as quickly as possible. Another thing that we've done is asking that 10% of certain federal education relief funds, approximating 26 million, be dedicated specifically to students with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and that money is allocated right away to address, these issues that have come up as a result of not being in the classroom for a full year or not getting the services that you need for a full year. And it's critical that that is done as quickly as possible. And Senator Kean and I are going to advocate that those bills move as quickly as possible. And the same thing on the learning loss. What funds are out there from the federal relief packages that we can use to address the learning loss quickly? Is it, I hate to say this, is it a longer school year? Is it offering what Joe's doing, summer camps and enrichment courses over the summer to get kids back up to speed, or those that were able to excel to take the additional classes and keep up with their studies? Do we do some of the things that Jersey Can suggested, master specialists, reading specialists? Senator Oraho has always been an advocate for a virtual high school in the state of New Jersey, because online does work for some students. And we've even read stories, where in certain situations, kids have excelled, usually at the high school level, doing the virtual learning. So is that an option for those students, where we do a statewide or a regional virtual high school for those students that want that type of education? But then for our students in the classroom, what do we need? Is it after school programs? Is it tutors? And how can we fund these programs? Because this was not anyone's fault. This was a virus that came with the unique challenges, and we're still dealing with them. But I think it's important that going forward into the next school year, we address them, and that for those parents and families and educators and principals that want their students back full time, that they have the ability to be back full time. So, I don't know if anybody has any questions for one another.
I've got one quick thing, which is, do you think special needs students would benefit in having another year of access to school services if it was requested by their parents, or 3 years even of extra school service beyond what we currently allow by law?
Who are you asking?
And it's a panel, all of the above.
We're all looking at each other. I don't know.
Senator Kane, I can tell you what we're doing in the summertime also. I think it is necessary. We're also providing additional wraparound services for our students that were identified during the year that struggled to carry that through the summertime and into the next school year. So I think it is really very, very important that those students are identified, and then certainly their needs addressed. So that's one of the things we're doing in the summertime. And again, wraparound services, which is so critical.
Thank you.
There were even conversations about allowing a student to repeat a year. And that would be, parents' choice, but it's certainly a conversation worth having, because they, have seen what the our general ed students are struggling. Not, just in different ways, but just as much as our special needs community. So, is that an option we put out there? That's a conversation definitely worth having. Or, Patricia, you address that, with your son struggling with math. What do you do?
And if I could just add, I think in addition to creating consistency across the state, I think the Department of Education, Department of Health, and our policies need to begin looking at the problem not as a single issue, COVID issue, right? We spent all of this time talking about the harms caused to the social, emotional, academic, et cetera, right? The risks to our students, right, have to be measured against any risks that COVID presents, right? So we cannot make policies even on 3 feet, 6 feet, right, to the exclusion of thinking of these other harms. And so I really hope, there's something in psychology that's called availability bias, right? That at some point, if all you're hearing about is one topic, right, you begin to give it more weight than you would otherwise. And I think that's happening right now. So we talk about the harm and then we come back to saying, well, it's this, COVID, right? We have the risk of COVID still. Well, how does that risk now weigh against these other risks? And I would suggest that if you put it on a scale, right, COVID back in March 2020 was a heavy weight. We knew nothing about it. We were fearful, right? It was a heavy weight. You drop that on the one side of the scale, yeah, it made sense to be as aggressive in perhaps closing and et cetera. But now we know so much more about that, about COVID and the risk it presents, who it affects most. And so we cannot put it on the scale at that same weight that we did back in March 2020. We have to unload some of that, and we have to start dropping on the other side of the scale all of these other harms. To me, it's very simple. It's a very simple solution. We get our kids back into school full time. We get our kids playing sports. One of the things we don't talk about, what about all those other extracurricular activities? What about our music students, our art students, our theater students? What about the chess club, right? What about the STEM club? What about all those students who had no access to sports during this pandemic? We need to readjust the scales. And when you do that, the solution to me is very clear. It's a very clear one. You get kids back into school, you loosen up the restrictions with respect to our children, right? And you start fixing the harm immediately. That is the first step to fixing the harm. And then on top of that, you layer the services and extended support that they're going to need for years to come. So I thank you for listening to my summary of what I really think the problem is.
Senators, if I could just piggyback on that for a moment, just as a building level administrator, a school administrator, first of all, I thank the parents, because what you did is summed up everything that we've experienced for the last 14, 15 months as school administrators. And, in some cases, the comments that you made and comments that were made to this administration over the year certainly resonated, and we did the best that we could to navigate this terrible situation, certainly. But one of the things that we really focused on here, and it probably happened right after we were out of school for a period of time, is we knew that we had to keep our doors open. I'm not sure how we were going to do it, but we had to. We had to get more students back to school. And the one thing, if I could urge everyone, and I agree with everybody that they're saying on this panel, come September, we all have to be back to school full-time with lunch and every aspect that goes along with it, because we can't do this to our students any longer. We just can't. So the policies have to be adjusted. They have to be revised. Everybody has to be on the same page. I know there's that one piece where they say 2 unrelated cases. Well, 2 unrelated cases here at Northern Highlands with 1,400 students is much different than 2 unrelated cases with the school that may only have 400 students. So everything has to just be it has to be consistent. And I do believe whoever's making these decisions and policies and revisions, I think you should have parents and educators on those committees as well, because those are the people who are living it every day. And sometimes when these new policies and these guidelines come out, I scratch my head and say, who's making these decisions without the input of people who are actually living it, and put students on that committee. Get someone like Devin on that committee. It's really very important. And the consistency, as I think is a theme here today, is really very, very important.
Thank you. I want to thank each and every one of you for participating today and sharing your experiences. It was really important, we think, to hear your stories And we appreciate you giving us the time today to be heard. I think in classroom education best helps our students learn and thrive. And we know there's serious negative consequences that our children are facing as they continue to learn remotely in social isolation, whether it be educational, emotional, socially, or developmentally. Unintended consequences, they've been on the rise. We need to get our children safely back in the classroom full-time and in person as soon as possible. So thank you. We're here to work with you, and we really appreciate what you said today.
And I'd also like to thank everyone for taking your time to be part of what we hope is going to be a ongoing and collaborative discussion about the education of all New Jersey students. We know that the past 2 years have presented so many challenges. But with your help, we hope to find a pathway for more hopeful education future for all of our kids and for all of New Jersey. And so thank you for your insights and your thoughtful recommendations. Thank you, Senator Corrado, for leading this effort.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, senators. Appreciate it.
Thank you, senators.